Hi everyone, continuing my let's start again. Hi everyone, continuing my photo size series, exercise and photography. So today I'm going to do just a little bit of a comparison using the Leica. I've got a 50mm 1.4 Summilux lens on this, and I'm going to compare this lens to a vintage lens. So the vintage lens that I have is this one here. So it's a Elmar 5cm f3.5. So I'm going to take a number of shots at the same aperture, so I guess f3.5, f5.6, maybe f11 or something like that on both lenses, and we'll see what sort of shots we get. The Elmar is a collapsible lens, so it actually goes flat when you put it away. I'm guessing that this lens is probably manufactured around the 1960 mark. Everything's in feet on the focus ring here, and made in Germany. The other lens that I'll be using is the Summilux, which is, I think, looking at the serial numbers, was manufactured somewhere maybe about 5 years ago. And the Leica that we're using here is the Leica M240P. One of the wharves here, I think it's a super yacht wharf here in Sydney. You can see Anzac Bridge in the background and Sydney in the background there. I guess one of the good things about COVID-19 right now and isolation is that we are able to do exercise here in Sydney, and we don't have the tourism, we don't have the crowd, so you've got this wonderful space, this wonderful city to yourself. There's always a silver lining to every situation, I suppose. So let's see what these lenses are like on the Leica, just for fun, I suppose. Okay, I'm in Lightroom now, and let's have a look at some of the photographs that we took. So the first two photographs, you can see the one on the left here and the one on the right. The one on the left here is the 50mm 1.4 Summilux, I should say. So the new lens on the left and the older lens, the vintage lens, on the right here. So first impressions are okay, and these are the JPEG files straight from the camera, so no further editing has occurred on these photographs. What I have noticed is the Summilux was shot at 1/90th of a second, the new camera, a new lens on the left, and the vintage lens, the camera chose 1/60th of a second exposure. Other than that, the two photographs are pretty much, I try to frame as close to identical as possible. And first impressions are the newer lens has a higher contrast and more pleasing colors than the vintage lens. When we zoom in a bit closer, we can actually just, let's go really close here and have a look. So this is 1:1, and the detail is pretty good in both lenses. I'm really impressed with the vintage lens compared to the new lens. And if I go in a bit further, we can see we've got a lot of detail there in both lenses. So far, I'm really impressed with the vintage lens, considering, I mean, I bought the Summilux second hand, but even second hand was like 4,500 Australian dollars. The vintage lens, I think, was about $250, so big difference in price. And so shooting at, now it's showing here, it's showing 4.8. I noticed that Lightroom and the Leica doesn't always interpret the f-stop correctly, because it's doing a light calculation as opposed to some sort of a direct link in the metadata. So I can't remember whether I shot at 3.5 or 5.6 in this case, but here we are. Here's the detail. So what I did notice is when I go to the top and we start looking at the rope, you can see the cobweb is really nice. A lot of detail in both situations. Again, it may be because of the JPEG file and some of the smoothing that we see slightly different here, but again, the detail is fantastic on the vintage lens compared to the new lens. A lot of detail in the rope. We'll go further up, so we're up near the edge of the photograph now. It's interesting, the new lens here, some of the detail starts to disappear, whereas the detail is there in the vintage lens. Isn't that interesting? And then in the background there you can see the level of blur that there is. Again, it's all very good. You see on the new lens it may be a bit smoother as far as the blur is concerned, or the bokeh, and slightly different on the vintage lens. There you go. So let's have a look more. So I've got the new lens on the left again, and the vintage lens on the right. Now you can see from the frame size numbers, pixels, they've been both slightly cropped, and I did that just to be able to get the photographs level and roughly the same amount of image in the same, so I can do the comparison. So straight away, like the other two photographs, there's more contrast in the new lens than the old lens. The shutter speed in this case here, both 125, 125th of a second in both photographs, both at 200 ISO, and shooting at f8 in both cases. So let's have a look at something with a bit more detail. So here I'm now at 3:1 and moving around the photograph, so we can have a look to see what we see. In both cases I haven't done any editing, I don't think, so basically these are the JPEG files as they've come out. It's all looking very good again. Again, very impressed with the vintage lens as far as the detail is concerned. The contrast, yes, it is different to the new lens, but with editing you can actually bring up the contrast quite well. And the level of detail, yes, okay, you can see the detail. There's more detail here in the background on the new lens, but that's the background, that's not what I was focusing on. I think I was focusing on infinity in both cases here. But either way, again, the detail is very good on the vintage lens. Yes, okay, you can see maybe a bit of difference there in the letters. So hard to tell. In real life situation, when you're taking the photograph and you're publishing the photograph, a lot of it's published on the internet, you wouldn't know the difference. Let's have a look at a couple more photos. Right, we have the new on the left and the vintage on the right again. Both shutter speed photographs have been taken at the same time, and both at the same f-stop at f8. On the histogram, when I'm going from new to vintage, you can see that there's a slight interpretation difference of the light, and that can be seen in the contrast levels again. It shows up in the histogram here. So if I go to the new lens, you can see how the darks come up more on the histogram, and that shows up as a contrast. So the contrast is better again on the new lens than on the vintage lens here. Having a look at some detail. Again, the detail is very good. And some detail over here. we go to the edges, let's have a look what's there. On the edges, I did notice that the new lens is more detailed, so we're shooting at f8. Got a more detail on the corners than you do in the vintage lens. So just, I suppose that's what you would also expect with an older lens. And if we go to the other side, you can see here again there is more detail in the building in the new lens compared to the vintage lens. Overall, both a lot of detail, very impressed with again both lenses, very impressed with the vintage lens. And I think we may have, I think that's it for the comparisons. So I took a whole bunch of more photographs with the vintage lens, which I'll show you now in a bit of a show. I hope you enjoy this comparison of old and new. There's a lot to be said about buying old lenses and just putting it on a digital mirrorless camera. Each lens, like every tool, has different aspects to it. The Summilux, new Summilux 1.4 obviously gives you that fast lens, a lot of light, so you can have a real shallow depth of field and a nice bokeh. The vintage collapsible lens means you can have a really compact setup and carry it with you, lightweight, and produces great results. And you'll see from the slideshow here, a lot of them were taken with extended shutter speeds of sometimes right up to 30 seconds. I have edited in Lightroom to bring up the contrast. I hope you enjoy the show, and subscribe and press the like if you've liked this video or like any aspect of it. Press the like. See you again on the next video. Thanks.